Well, my heart is going pitter-pat. It's the end of the week, but I am really glad to be here with you. And the title, or what I was asked to do, was to give a pastoral response to the week, which would be awesome enough in itself with the fine presentations we've had with Kathleen's good leadership, and now with my president sitting in the audience when he said he would not be here. So all these things have occurred. But in many ways, what I want to do is welcome you again to Gettysburg. So before I move on too much farther, I also want to make some acknowledgments. All the persons here present, but as will become apparent, I had some conversations with M. Cole, who is the Executive Director for Voices of History Project, and I'll say more about that. Bill is a living spirit and embodied feel for me throughout what this is all about, and to kind of do a little giveaway about signs of hope amidst struggle. I find that I sense Bill's having been with me, with us, been with me through the course that I taught, that just sort of graciously came my way because of his efforts, really is a sign of hope amidst the many struggles that I'll be pointing to, and I hope it will be that way for you. I'm trying to front load this because with signs of hope, because there also will be some signs that may not sound so hopeful. So I'm trying to get it up because there also may be some things that may not be so up as I move along. Ben Neely, Director of the Historic Collections at Adams County, was very helpful in what he did to help me think and then rethink the history of disabilities, the Civil War, and Gettysburg. Just a word about the Voices of History Project. In 2006, the Adams County Historical Society, which is the historical society for the county that is located in the building over there, and this seminary have formed a partnership, a collaboration to rehab that building that you've been walking across, back and forth, the centerpiece in some ways of the campus, to reimagine how it might become a centerpiece where anywhere from 80 to 100,000 visitors annually may, instead of just driving by, park themselves, come to learn about, on the first floor, the battle, on the second floor, the hospital, and the third floor, the history of the seminary and religion. Or as the director there says, on the first floor we will shoot you, on the second floor we will save your body, and on the third floor we will save your going down. Third floor will shoot you, second floor will save your body, first floor save your soul. Some see that as saying, well, at least the seminary has a little place on the soul part. My vision, everybody, is that in fact that all has to do with the work of God for better and for worse, and how we will be able to revision that as a way for us to think about questions of war and peace, church and state, slavery, freedom, and consolation for suffering is what we'll be about. So here is Gettysburg in 1913, 50 years after the battle. Sometimes has been called the most beautiful place in the world. Now, why would that be, given all the other locales that are here? It is an unusual topography with mountains to the west, kind of a flattening to the east, a kind of little bit of both, which has something to do with why, in fact, the battle did occur here. But I don't think it's just the eyes of faith or romanization to say it is a beautiful place, and I hope you've come to experience that. Another shot looking out. But right away, there's something that intrudes or shows itself here. And that many of you may know that to the west of here is Camp David. And my sister, who has a really nice penthouse in Bethesda, and when I'm up on her 13th floor and I look out, we will look out occasionally and see about 4 miles away helicopters sometimes flying northwest. And we realize they're flying from Pentagon and other areas on their way up to Camp David. But that's also a piece of what this experience here is about, this kind of intersection in a very pastoral setting. Suddenly you will encounter other kinds of realities. And another reality that has, I would say, for the good, intruded itself is that National Park Service building there, where I think there has been a renewed emphasis on the new birth of freedom from the interpretation. How many of you have had a chance to visit the new visitor center? Okay, so, more of you than I would have expected, so I'm happy for that. Then let me begin with some poetry, and I would wonder if there's someone who would like to be a reader. If not, of course I will. A poem about Gettysburg. Okay, here we go.
The Battlefield Museum Guide Speaks by Carmen Saracino. Here they come in SUVs, minivans, RVs, Honda Accords, converging on this town from north and south, just as did those thirsty, dust-choked troops, marching, staggering, booted, barefoot, sunstroked, on the Carlisle Pike, the Taneytown Road, jammed with caissons, cavalry, ambulances, beeves on the hoof. Banners snapped in the wind. Riders pulled up shouting, pointing. Drovers cursed and cracked their back snakes. The wagons, heaped with ammunition, rations, dog tents, stoves, kettles, pans, entrenching tools, and with stack and stacks, and not nearly enough pine boxes. Before the lines could even form, surgeons rushed, setting up tables.
And I'll continue. What myth, what delusion draws them to Little Round Top, the wheat field, Devil's Den, Cemetery Ridge? What do they imagine happened here? Now I see, Whitman wrote, war is just butchery, the glistening weapons, tools for slaughter. Don't they know that? Don't they know what? Or is there still a truth that draws them here? See the Rotarian in baseball cap and old guy shorts. How his shoulders hunch around the place in his chest. Scarred, still aching, since the morning his daughter, just 9, was diagnosed. How he cared for her, giving every pill in proper order at 2 a.m., at 5 a.m., patting her hair, touching a small sponge to her cracked lips. Intently he points his camera at the spot Chamberlain and remnants of the 20th Maine, bleeding, outnumbered, without a round of ammunition, refused to give up, facing odds as impossible as surviving leukemia in 1960, as impossible as surviving the death of one's child. He snaps a picture of where they charged, by God, charged. And so they come and come, bumper to bumper, the young for what they suspect, the old for what they know. And you, reader, audience, haven't you been marched toward what you could not bear? Didn't you fear you might run? Did you run? Haven't you carried a comrade hanging on your neck? Does the cold ache your scars? You know then, don't you, what hollows this ground and why they come? So here's a summary of what I would like to do together with you today. It is a pastoral response, very much in the context of this place. My method for doing so is really the method of contextual theology and lived religion, a shameless plug for my new book, Pastoral Bearings, Lived Religion and Pastoral Theology, the way in which pastoral theologians such as myself are increasingly turning to stories, contextual studies. Frankly, we're rating historians for their work in the sense of saying, what can we learn from the stories of others? And my thesis is that in the midst of the struggles that took place at Gettysburg and still take place here on many issues, including disabilities, and that's what I'll be focusing on, signs of hope may be discerned in that strife and beyond that strife, I think. God's grace may be discerned amidst the ambiguities of existence. And my takeaway is that I dare to sort of focus on this place where I am, where you are now, but where most of you won't be, to think about how, are there any analogies behind some of the things I'll be describing with some of the things that you will be returning to? Are there some questions that you hear me raising about this place that may also apply to your place? Questions also that may have some signs of hope or glimmers of reality from our work together this week. So I'll talk about the battle itself and meaning making. I'll talk somewhat about the aftermath here. I'll mention some things about struggles then and now. I have some pastoral diagnoses, that famous word diagnosis, which just means seeing through some of the struggles as I understand them. Another look, some grace, some sin, in the story of Civil War and disabilities, and hopefully, I think, some hopeful conclusions. Well, here it is. Or there it was, founded in 1826. Is now the oldest Lutheran seminary still in existence. This photo was taken after the battle, but it's probably not a bad representation of what it looked like at the time. The fences would be for, any guesses? Livestock. Yes, you heard cats, you heard students, and livestock was also a piece of what this was about. Well, there he is, the president then, Samuel Simon Schmucker. He was a pietist. He was an ecumenicist. Some have called him an abolitionist. That's maybe a stretching of the term. He certainly was anti-slavery. He also was quite the disciplinarian here on campus. I don't know that he wrote the book Discipline and Punish, but I sometimes wonder if he might not have, in terms of he would occasionally check up on students and saying, listen, are you really reading your texts or are you reading something idle? And when they would complain about the food, he would say, well, you're thinking too much about worldly things. So that was a part of his piety, was a strict concern for things. But he was ahead of his time in many ways in talking about the evils of slavery. And as I mentioned the first day with you all, that actually one of his concerns, and I learned this from Mark Oldenburg, his concern about slavery was not just questions of human freedom, but how slavery deprived the slave of the opportunity to exercise his or her abilities in society. That, in other words, they could not be contributors. There's some problems perhaps with that notion of the human good, but we'll return to that. So here is this building that you've been walking by to and from. How many of you have actually been in it? Some of you have, most of you here. It was the center of the firestorm on July 1st. And there it is in the center. And there, troops, Confederate troops coming from the west, they also came from the north, flanking. And you could say that this is another piece of the story here, and there's no other way to say it, but this is a place where many disabilities were acquired. This land, this place, is a place where many disabilities were acquired. It is fair to say that probably more disabilities have been acquired on this theological campus than any other seminary in the United States. Probably more disabilities were also treated, and I'll talk about that, at the hospital, which was what Old Dorm became. So this place became a hospital, as did the entire town after the battle. From Ben Neely, they've really upped the number that they thought were treated there. About 600, maybe 700 persons were treated over the course of the battle, the weeks afterward. And they have documentation on about 80% of the cases. And he says it's clear that 85% of those who were treated were permanently and fully disabled as a result of what occurred here. So that is a piece of our history. Part of our history is that there were more people shot and killed on our seminary grounds than any other seminary in the United States. That's part of who we are. I can tell you that, in fact, the 1st South Carolina probably went right through here around the east side of the seminary building, and it's flanking and taking this ridge. And it was here, but it was also elsewhere. So there were some 30,000 wounded persons in a town of 2,500. Camp Letterman was filled to its capacity by late July, and eventually was a hospital hosted about 1,600 patients. Surgeons worked long hours in treating the wounded. Amputations were performed in front of a surgical tent, and there were rows and rows of such tents. So the stories are here. The stories are here as well as of baskets of disabled limbs being moved out of Old Durham during the battle. So that's part of who we are. A part of who we are is this history of despite itself. Early on July 1st, the German pietists looked west, and instead of mountains out there, there were a horde of troops like a tsunami coming their way and descended on them and brought new realities and new meaning to this place. This is a place where people think about meaning. Helen Wendler at Harvard, I think, put it so clearly. In one sense, this place is like any other place on earth. It has no meaning, you might say, in and of itself as bare reality, but there is meaning making that is brought here because what the word Gettysburg itself evokes and continues to remind people of. And this is from these are the very last words of Bruce Catton's book, The Glory Road, in which he's told the story of the Army of the Potomac leading up to and after the battle at Gettysburg. And he's telling the story of the dedication by Lincoln at the National Cemetery, and is saying, trying to make sense of what all the suffering was about, that the dead were there, Valley of Dry Bones, waiting, he says, for a word, waiting for the word that would bring meaning, that perhaps there was meaning somehow, perhaps the whole of it was greater than the sum of its tragic parts, including parts that concern disabilities. And perhaps the thing could be said at last, so the dry bones of the country's dreams could take on flesh. He concludes, these are the last words, the tall man in the black frock coat got to his feet with 2 sheets of paper in his hand. He looked out over the valley and began to speak. That's the way the book ends. That's the way the book ends. It ends that way because at some level we know what comes next, or we hope we know what comes next, and I'll return to that. So let me say something now more about how this place and that nation in some ways has coped with the question of disabilities because of the battle. And again, I'm a pseudo-historian. I thank my colleagues for the work they do in archives, and then I raid their research and try to make practical meaning out of it. Before I get too much farther, you may be able to find copies of this book, The Hospital and Seminary Ridge at the Battle of Gettysburg. I think Sherry has copies still next door, and it's really a wonderful, good telling of what occurred. But we know that after the war, Gettysburg became a place where people continued to return to make sense of the suffering that occurred. This is the 1937 reunion, where the Peace Light was established. There's this history here and history throughout that I can only abbreviate to give you a sense of this continuing honoring of veterans, especially the disabled. There's this notion of their being put up, and you may tell where I'm going with this, put up on a pedestal in some way. But clearly, too, and this is from 1913, there was an attempt to bring about healings of many kinds. And if you want a really good book to get into that, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, which David Blight at Yale says really there were 2 competing features that work in the meaning-making and memory and memorization of the war. One was trying to reunite the nation, and the other was to honor racial struggle, and the 2 were at odds. The 2 were at odds in how they were portrayed. And so at the 1913 reunion, of course, some of you may know those are the Confederate veterans on your right and Union soldiers on the left, reaching over walls. Good fences make bad neighbors, perhaps, so one can reach over a wall in forms of healing for suffering. Peace Light later established, a new nation being born. Of course, the Klan will come and visit the following year in the heels of this. That's also part of our history. But it is fair to say that if you read the histories, this memorization of the veterans and providing societies. Bruce Catton himself tells stories about growing up in in Michigan, and wounded, disabled veterans just being a part of the town, being a part of the town life. Colleagues I know who are from the South will again talk about Confederate disabled veterans being around town squares. I mean, this was a part of the memory of the place. And institutions that were established, homes for disabled veterans. Scores of them set up, run in a military fashion, changing, initially called asylums, later changed to home to try to connote something. But this is a part of the memory. Stately homes signifying concern. And I would say romantic, at times idealized portraits of suffering became part of the lore of the place. Continued remembering going on. This is from 2000. The 137-year-old tale of one soldier's hand-me-down limb. Strange tales being told in stories for mass consumptions. The disabled as objects of fascination, with fascinating objects. The disabled as resilient. He managed to keep trucking along. These are some of the memories that are passed along. And in North Carolina, broad public support. The state spent more than $80,000 annually. The state of North Carolina, after the war between 1866 and 1870, $80,000, a combined budget for local budgets and state schools was $155,000. That's over 50% of the state budget going to care of disabled veterans out of the state budget of North Carolina after the war. So begin to pay attention to all these factors that are occurring. And here in Gettysburg, parades, attempts to honor the wounded still going on. Well, that's one way to cast things. But some struggles, and I'll just sort of say it now, back to President Schmucker. He was kind and concerned to teach wounded persons theology in Old Dorm. He would spend time there, but he wanted them out. He wanted them out as fast as they could get out of there. He wanted to get back to the business of theological education. And the letters are there, the stories are there, and you can imagine his feeling like, as many people did, suddenly there's this massive federal bureaucracy that has descended on your town. They say they're trying to do the best they can, but do you have a hermeneutic of suspicion that your interests are being taken into account or not? And this continually writing letters, get them out, get them someplace else. We have to start school in September of 1863. The students are there. So ambiguities, new realities begin to creep in. And I will now move on to what is a current reality, and I'll let it. This is from the Gettysburg Times, April 28, 2010. That is headline material from our local newspaper. The term that was used was the town's ADA nightmare. And in some ways, I don't know if I need to read this out for recording. In some ways, anyone having, they never ask if people are having trouble reading, or just like you ask trouble hearing. But can I entrust that you all can, rather than my reading what is here, you can take some of this in? I think I can. This is the reality. When I told people that I was going to be teaching a course on disabilities with Bill Gaventa, the number of people in Gettysburg who I met who immediately referred to this was astounding, including people here on this campus. And here's the next reality. And another. The suits coming in faster than can be processed. This is from February 5th. I'm going to return to this note. If some of you are a bit stunned by that headline, I continue to be stunned by that headline, and I have questions about what that is. But I will return to that in my diagnosis. It is very clear that there's money that's going to be spent to help try to find accommodations if they can be made here. And it is without question that much of this is being spearheaded by someone who identifies herself as a disabled right activist, retired from the college, who now lives in Maryland. And it may be hard for you to read, but in fact she has filed suit against a local blog here for defamation of character in terms of their responses to what she, in response to what she has been about. And I will share with you some of the things that are from that blog to give you a feel for what may be occurring here. And I've heard this from other people who have said, and I almost don't want to say anything, not wanting to be brought into a suit, but in terms of the issue. But a number of people have said, well, if people would comply, maybe this wouldn't be happening. This is a tougher one. Those are misspellings. Knows just enough about local government to be dangerous. A judge should order a warrant for her arrest as a public nuisance. And if a legal system supports this type of behavior and uses taxpayers' money to hear this, then they should be wrangled and arrested also. This is Gettysburg, as we are. And one person has said, well, I think she has her head in the right place. Buildings. But how can we do this in a town of the past, 1863? I thought her response to this was pretty ingenious. She links it with the question of civil rights, and says in 1863 individuals, because of race, gender, and disability discrimination, were denied equal rights, and she clearly understands her struggle that way. But I bring this to you to say this is sort of the reality of this place as well. And as I think about that, I did some revisioning of some of the images that I showed you before of idealized suffering, and I will show you now some from that era that somehow seem less, that I think are kind of harsh, but they are real. This was a photo taken from a photo of a soldier who had been in Old Dorm, who wound up in one of the soldiers' homes. But in fact, he went on furlough and never returned, and the story was they were glad to be rid of him. He was an alcoholic, they said. He was somehow not seemly in his behavior. He was a problem person. And suddenly, the more one looks at some of these stories, somehow harsher they become. And stories of people who had to sell photos to take care of themselves. Let me then, if I may, give some diagnoses of what I think what some of these struggles are about. Here's Gettysburg again, and Eric, are you out there? Yeah. When we went to the visitor center and we're driving back, he made the comment saying, "No, the borough. It seems to be the battlefield seems to surround it." And it does. And everyone knows that has led to tensions in this town. This is also a town of conflict between public, private, and vested interests. That's a piece of what this place is about. In his wonderful book, The History of the Borough, James Weeks will tell the story that this is a town where tensions between marketplace and memory and secular and sacred abide. This is a piece of what it means to have what happened here and people wishing both to memorialize but also in some sense continue to exist are about. So some of my pastoral diagnosis is that I think we can say, and some of this I found some consonance with what Tom Reynolds had been saying, that it is easier to romanticize the past, and there is a romanticization that occurs here, than deal with its ambiguities, realities, and its presence. It's easier to romanticize the disabled than to try to understand all their complex and I'll also say simple lives. We like to use the word complexity, but in other words, I'll say all of us are complex at some level. We're all simple, and it's easier to forget that. And I think it was easier for the nation to have them hidden away in homes and to glorify them instead of thinking about the disabled as before us, among us, instead of the disabled as us. I think, and again, I was struck with some consonance between what I heard Tom do in his paper. The disabled as those people, sources of opposition for some, who are different from us, better than us, more long-suffering. I think that's part of the history that came out of the past, who must be accommodated, who must be lectured on by the non-disabled, versus all of us who are suffering and frightened and hoping for a better future. And finally, it's an overused term. I love the way in The Sopranos someone unpacked them in the first season. Someone unpacked the term objectification. He asked me about that later. Someone explained it to someone else what objectification meant. But the disabled who are objects of concern, anger, add-ons, pity, worry, wariness, entitlements, accommodation, special programs, special education, gazes, avoidance, special parties, special conferences, engagements, instead of the disabled as human beings with a story of human despair and human hope. This is a quick aside for the book. My colleague at Memphis Theological Seminary who wrote a chapter, her contribution called Resisting the Stare, deals more with questions of objectification and the disabled. I know I'm moving somewhat quickly through this. I have this metaphor of ADA as nightmare. I mean, the more I thought, when I saw that, I thought, I mean, could one imagine a local newspaper saying something, oh, the Civil Rights Act as nightmare? And then I thought, well, yeah, actually, I might be able to imagine that, a paper doing that. But my immediate suspicion was, why is it that some groups of persons are seen as those persons who are sources of nightmare? And I tried to stay with this metaphor of nightmare, and I thought, well, maybe I'll show you some images out there of nightmares. Quick, do a lot of PowerPoint things. But I think instead, I'll ask you to think for yourself about nightmares unhelpful, as that which is other than us, that visits us when we are most vulnerable or threatened. And I think some business owners would say that's how they're experiencing many things. When we are most in economic hard times, most needing restoration, most needing fortification, which appear to us when we are almost dead in our sleep, sort of being flanked. Or can we think about nightmares as that which are part of us, that we deny? That we say it's not us or some other, but in fact, it's not just this thing that goes bump in the night, but it's actually, nightmares are the very beating of our own heart. I'm appealing to a Jungian notion. I don't always go with Jung on much. But I mean, a Jungian notion of nightmare, not so much as threat, but the threat of ourselves coming to us. And so finally, I think about fears of the disabled, and I mean objective and subjective genitive sense. And I wonder if partly what's occurring here is this notion of anxiety that's raised up, that there's something sinful occurring, I'll name it, and that sin is not natural for humanity in the sense that, but is it necessary? I think one way to understand is that what I'm describing are forms of conflict that make sense. So I now went to look for a little hope in history through all of this. And some of you may know the quote by James Joyce, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." Or might we say history is a way of discerning some signs of hope amidst sinful realities? So I did some digging, and I think I found both. I'll start with some of the more difficult realities, and some of this comes from a journal, from the Alabama Law Review. Yes, I found help from lawyers in trying to unpack this. And there are sad stories from the North in the question of the Union disabled, that those with infectious diseases and nervous disorders were less likely to receive their pensions. And pensions were also more likely to be rewarded in swing states by whoever was in power in Washington. They wanted to, they wanted to award those who would help who was ever in power. And it's very clear that African American soldiers had higher rates of rejection and throughout the process. But there are sad stories from the South that there really were competing public interests in the awarding of pensions there, funds that were spent on disabled Southern veterans. And again, you have to understand the enormous amount of these relatively small budgets in the South after the war. And they would claim that could have been spent on schools, roads, public health. Why? For political purposes. The disabled as mute icons of the South's glorious past, and therefore pawns of those in power with racist intents. In other words, they had body capital. Summary of the sin, avoid continued discrimination, blacks being those people, objectification, pawns in the North, and revered as living monuments in the South. Stories of hope. Getting there. It's an untold story. It hasn't been, but it's clear that to use that overused term these days, that the disabled veterans of the North had agency. They lobbied. They formed associations. That it was not simply because they were treated as icons by others, but also by their continued efforts that they began to achieve some recognition. And yes, they used lawyers and grassroots advocacy to actually expand the notion of entitlements to a variety of persons. Now, some of you would say, is that good news? Well, I'm betraying my politics. I think yes. And I have further thoughts about what that means about the power of those who have no power or seemingly have no power to be of benefit to society in terms of how their rights are recognized and how that can be a means of extending rights to others. How much? 42%, somewhere around 42% of the federal budget in 1890 going to, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And may we pause at this moment when we hear in various times about where money, when people say there is no money, or rather we don't have the money, one may also ask, well, are you saying there is no money or the money is not available for this or that? It's kind of astounding, and it needs to be looked at again. And again, there's sufferings that occur in some ways because people are being used this way. But I cannot get over that fact. And it continues to be documented and written about. So as I think about our current controversies and where people say, well, it's just too costly, my question is, well, what are your objectives? What are you looking for? I take this as a hopeful story. This process, it's been documented, transformed Washington from the sleepy, hot, mosquito-ridden town that it still is to a bureaucratic center. Hopeful. Set up structures and expectations for expansion of benefits and entitlements to many other persons. The material was laid out. The formulas were laid out for the development of things in the 1930s here in terms of Social Security processes that were laid out by what the disabled and their bureaucracies that were set in place for them. That translated into further benefits for society. Who talks about that? And it's clear that this may be seen as, everyone says, well, gee, disabled, I always thought it was medical problems, now we're thinking of them as social construct. Well, no. It's clear that the question of who the disabled were and how they saw themselves clearly played out into the social construct of their role within society at this time. And they saw themselves not just as problems, but as social realities and the situation that needed to be addressed. So I would say part of this is the power of advocacy, the ability of the disabled to extend rights and entitlements to all, and the role of the union disabled in strengthening the power of the federal government, achieving some war aims in that business. And here I want to take sort of an aside, which is, and I know we've had some really rich conversation about is there something limiting about saying the power of persons who are disabled to contribute to the common good, where it would seem as if those perhaps with certain intellectual disabilities might not be able to do so. I wonder if another way of thinking about that is, on the other hand, might not our extending rights and entitlements to persons in need, whether they themselves advocate for it or not, we may see as being of benefit to all. And therefore, I claim, may we not claim that in being remembered by God, by being remembered by and to the civil community, even if they are not able themselves to advocate for themselves, may we not also see that perhaps as the handiwork of God through God's, I guess they call it left hand, through the civil realm as a way in which they are remembered by God through processes of civil discourse. So this next slide, I think, is a little bit for Hans, because I know we were at the visitor center yesterday and the day before, and he bought, this would be sort of upping the ante of my argument, which would be, who knows who this is, this character from the movie Gettysburg. It's a fictitious character, but he makes this character, Buster Kilrain, who does not exist, and people continue to look for him. In his discussions with the professor of religion, which is what Chamberlain was, makes the argument that what matters, Colonel, is justice. Of course, I myself would not say that's a central claim, but I'm trying to reintroduce that as an important kind of claim by which we, as people of faith, may see God to be at work. So here, I hope, then, are some more hopeful conclusions. We live with a lot of not yet, but I want to look for some glimmers of hope as well back here at Gettysburg, things that I have found helpful. And I do go back to the Voices of History project, and I do go back to my conversations with Ben Neely, and I mean this in the sense of my 2 weeks ago kind of saying, how can I make sense of this reality and this history? And I came to Gettysburg for friends. I came to Gettysburg for colleagues, and realized I went knocking on the door of the Historical Society, and Ben, who's been gracious in so many ways, is telling me it's unbelievable, but of all these histories that are out there about Civil War veterans, in part because of problems of documentation and cataloging, but in part because nobody's taken the effort, there really have not yet been told the stories of the lives of the Civil War disabled. I mean, and most Civil War medicine is about how to cut people up and where to drop things off and like that. And he's saying, it's not out there. And he's saying he's beginning to do that. And our hope is that we will begin to tell stories. That we will actually follow these people from their time here to their time away, including John Durkin, whose leg and genitals I showed you, and sort of tell some of these stories as part of the reality of what this is about. That it's, in other words, not just the stories of those who can march with crutches in parades and just make everybody feel good, but also those who are experienced by themselves and others just getting by, and just to have these stories told. So I'm saying two things. My hope is in the project, and my hope is in the fact that I turned to a friend and he was helpful. Another wonderful occurrence here was 7 chaplains from Walter Reed Army Hospital and Bethesda Naval Medical Center descended here, and with much help from Kathleen and with me in this project, and gave a talk on pastoral care for the returning veteran, and brought materials around the question of disabilities and among veterans who are returning today. And a sign of hope, I think, for Gettysburg is that we do draw people here. People want to come to Gettysburg and talk about important things. And that does seem to be part of our blessing as well, along with the contention. Signs of hope that people do come here and bring us questions about how to make a better world. Conversation I had with M. Cole, who's director for Voices of History project, where in his reflection with me, he's also a lawyer, in his reflections with me about I said to him, well, I'm going to mention the disabilities conflict, and I want your advice and counsel. Like, what should I say or not? But he began to unpack this question of, well, what's reasonable? Well, in law has to think about what's reasonable, but how the question of reason in law can be misused, about concerns of business owners. But, I mean, he finally said, we're all saints and sinners, and some say this is Lutheran pessimism, which is like, oh, well, people are going to get nailed, no matter what, that's the way the world is. Or can that be a sign of humility and looking for resolutions beyond law? He's a lawyer who's hoping for resolutions beyond law. Might that be possible? Might new things emerge? And there are other realities that just kind of show themselves here, and here is Bill and the course that we taught last semester. And there's a beautiful way, it came to me as kind of a beautiful thing as I thought about this course that Bill and I worked on, that it really skirted the whole conflict here in town. It really did. I mean, we talked about it as kind of like the context, but there was a beautiful way in which we dealt with it and sort of said, well, guess what? There's other realities of disabilities in Gettysburg. There's a family here who is aging and trying to make sense of how they're going to care for this profoundly developmentally disabled daughter, and loving her and moving on. There's a young woman in town who's making new friends and trying to figure out what it means to be a teenager and coming of life. And suddenly, all these other realities also are part of the story, are also part of the story here, and show themselves, the kinds of human relational things. And Bill brought that to our process, and I think Bill continues to bring that to our work. Dare I say, another sign of hope? We'll talk more about that, ways in which we might move forward. Now I'm going to grandstand myself and sort of say, well, yeah, I found it hopeful that I was able to give a talk at the Lincoln Cemetery here in Gettysburg. The Lincoln Cemetery is where African American soldiers after the war were buried because they were not permitted to be buried in the National Cemetery where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. So continuously there have been two Memorial Day celebrations in Gettysburg, the one at the National Cemetery, and there continues to be one at the Lincoln Cemetery. And I was invited there and gave a talk about God's plans for the good ironies of hope. Perhaps you may pick up on a leitmotif that moves itself into this one as well. And I was able to identify that actually the original Memorial Day celebration actually was one instituted by African Americans after the Civil War to honor the Union cause and liberation. It was not simply an honoring of end of war. It was one that tried to raise up the higher values for which I would believe the war was about. And I use this, and I think in a helpful way, as a word of hope in a place of struggle, addressing the fact that the movement Aryan Nations came just a couple of weeks after this, and we had a counter rally here. So I was trying to say, well, in the midst of difficulties, yes, everything in the world comes to Gettysburg. That's part of who we are. That we can work for hope. Here's a pause, and I'll just sort of say we can talk more about this. If some of you see me melding civil and religious discourse, yes. And part of this has to do with my... Actually, I take sympathy that the Bartian theologian Catherine Tanner does this, because she says inevitably discourses are mixed up with that which is finite and fallible, including the telling of the Christian narrative. I would say theology is always told in a location, but she would say, and I would argue, to take us to another location, to the future, to the reign of God. I said that pretty quickly, but I could talk more about that. So let me go back to the National Cemetery, and this, what I found so powerful about what Catton did here. I mean, I am summing up. What I found so powerful about what he did at the conclusion of his book was that he left it to our imagination, but also to our certainty that we know what comes next. He didn't have to say it. He didn't have to say that there would be something hopeful that would come. He knew that we knew that something that might bring a word of healing might come. And might that not be our hope based on some hopeful realities that we have among us, that in the midst of that which is tragic, in the midst of that where there are many in the valley of dry bones in which we live, whatever that might be, that there's something that we also have a promise of that will come our way. Yes, I am mixing civil and religious discourse here. And I think that's what Jim Weeks does in his book, that he says at the conclusion of his wonderful telling of all the struggles and contests here, he says, finally, the meaning of this place, if it is about anything, it's for the future. It's for trying to create realities that may in some ways try to instantiate some of the questions around freedom, justice, and community, that if this struggle had any meaning or any good to it, any redemptive possibilities would show itself, and that there are great tasks that remain before us. So we want to take you away from where you are. There's the battlefield itself, and it's a very strange place. We didn't have all these. We got a new cannon on campus last year, courtesy of the National Park Service, and a river runs through it, a road runs through our campus. It is not our road. It's federal property, and that's just part of what it means to be here, is to sort of be bisected by other realities, and how we might use that in a way to think about better realities. I think that's why I came here. That's why I picked up stakes and moved to Gettysburg. And here's the town again, and we're on the far left, just below the northern marker there. And here's an aerial view, kind of distant. And here's an aerial view of our campus, where we worship, where we are now, there, and that unusual building in the middle. And memory lane for some of you will be shortly. I took this a couple of weeks ago. No, look at those cars, actually. Anybody know what make of car that is? I mean, sometimes you'll see this. You'll find processions of certain makes of cars kind of going down the street. But this is memory lane, but it's what I walk daily. And I took that last summer where I live, and I thought, that looks pretty good. And it is a beautiful place. And I hope you'll be able to carry some things that will give you hope in the future. So, my last slide, unfinished work from our meeting. Something's blowing in the wind, I think, here. Amos isn't here to talk about Geist and spirit, but I think he kind of got at it in a way. There's been talk about another Gettysburg Address or another manifesto coming from this community. And here we have melding of discourse. I don't do the kind of empirical research I used to do when I was at Vanderbilt, but I'm enough of an old researcher to know that there's research possibilities do abound here, but also this kind of research is research that might make a difference. Things that can be used. I think I have found ways to focus on God's good work that persists among many struggles. It seems like new friendships have been forged, and I trust and hope that God's creative work is at work among us. So thank you for our time together, and I will be stepping down, but I truly mean I think what comes next I would see as a continuation, because what I think is coming next is going to be conversation about who we are and what we've done and where we're going from here. So thank you for that, and God's blessings.